Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us here on The Avid Reader. As always, today our guest is Melissa Scholes Young, and we'll be talking about her latest novel, The Hive, which was published by Turner and released just last week. Melissa is the author of the novel Flood, and she's editor of Grace and Darkness and Furious Gravity, which are two anthologies of new writings by DC women writers. She's a contributing editor at Fiction Writers Review, and her work has appeared in The Atlantic, Washington Post, many other periodicals. So The Hive, four sisters, four generations, the Fehlers, a pest extermination company, a mom, Grace, and a dad, Robbie. Each of the sisters is different, cut from whole cloth. And while their lives depend on, in large part, the family business, each has their own separate life and personality. And though, as I said, each is different in many ways, they form their own hive, where loyalty, hard work, and a community of shared interest allows and even fosters a community not unlike that of the bees, who in our own reality, our world, shape the future in a great part, and like the largest ecosystem our planet relies on. So welcome, Melissa, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Sam. I'm a big fan of the podcast, so it's an honor to be here.
Oh, thanks so much. So what do you know about pests? Not me, but just pests in general.
So that's a great question. I know a great deal about pests. I actually grew up in a family pest control business in rural Missouri. But the Hive is not my family story, but the territory is very familiar. So I also grew up in Missouri. I did not have sisters. I have a whole bunch of brothers. But when you grow up in a family business, it's its own ecosystem, right? It has its own set of characters, and secession is always a place of tension. So some of this book comes from that, but it's not really my family story.
It's interesting because, you say pest control, and then you talk about bees. Like I have this new house I'm buying, and there's a bunch of honeybees that have this ginormous hive underneath the shingles, and I got to remove them. And I was telling my partner, we need to get rid of those. And she says, no. It was a knee-jerk response. I didn't think about it.
Yeah. And I think many people think about pests that way. I live in Washington, D.C., and we are being absolutely infested by cicadas. In fact, I have a sound machine on, Sam, so that the cicada noise outside the window, you won't be able to hear it on the podcast.
Yeah, I saw President Biden get hit by one on the back of his neck.
They are dive bombing us. They are living their absolute best lives for the time that they have here. And last week I was on St. Louis Public Radio, and they told me to have a blanket ready to actually put over my head in case the sound was so bad that we would have to try to drown out the cicadas. It seems very normal to me when you grow up in a family pest control business, and we lived way out in the country. So our animals, our land, bees, everything very much had to work in cooperation. And so it feels familiar to me. But if you've got a house and a property with a hive, you are very, very lucky indeed. It means that you'll have better flowers. It means you can grow things. Everything depends on each other. And so protecting the hives, protecting the bees, rather than fearing them, I think that's great territory.
Yeah. And out of all the sisters, and I mentioned them briefly, but out of all the sisters, Kate is so interesting because she's the one that seems closest to that part of the business and that culture, right?
I think because she's the one who observes. She's the one who watches everyone else in the family. She keeps these spreadsheets about what happens to her sisters. And she also is the one that's most curious about not just the dogs, but about bed bugs and about the direction that the family business could take. And she also has this very special relationship with Val, who's the dog trainer who trains dogs to identify bed bugs. And the thing that's fascinating to me, not just about bees, but about bed bugs, is that they are this fantastic class divider, or I would say class revealer, right? We think of pests as something that are in homes that are not as clean. But the truth is, bed bugs travel in the best hotels in the world. And so the more mobility you have, actually, the more likely you are to have an infestation like that. So Val is trying to teach the Fehlers also how to live in more conjunction with them. And the truth is, bed bugs do better with, to eliminate them, you need heat rather than chemicals. So there's all these fascinating ways that we think of pest control in one way, but I think maybe it's more like pest management. Like, how do we learn to live with them rather than fear and reject them and just simply eliminate them? So all of those things, that curiosity, I think, went into my writing of Kate.
I know it's so funny how people, like, I think I've traumatized my kids with bugs because I bring them to them and they get all nervous. But like, I was taking a shower the other day when there was a daddy long legs in the shower, and I was thinking, oh, I need to. And I go, I don't need to do anything. Mm-hmm. He's fine. We can take a shower together. It's not hurting either of us.
Maybe you just need to watch him, because Daddy Longlegs put on quite a show.
He was just dropping down, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, why isn't he walking down the wall? It's just like, it's so cool.
I would argue, Sam, you might be just exposing the kids in a useful way. I don't have any fear at all, and it has to come from the fact that we had hissing cockroaches on our kitchen counter, and they were like pets to us. But there was this respect and fascination with the insects, even though, you know, our family business was to get them out of your house. I mean, it's complicated, but most things are.
You know, I jump around, and it's like, I keep thinking we're trying to sell your book, but I think this helps. But you've mentioned bed bugs like twice, and then when I read it, I didn't believe Maggie's theory. So then I researched it, and I found out 117, 118 degrees. I had no idea you could most efficaciously remove bed bugs with heat.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the great part about writing a novel where you get to do so much research, is research is a fantastic way to actually avoid writing because it feels like you're doing something where maybe you are. I mean, I believe in a lot of input. I read a lot. I do a lot of research. And you're right, Maggie knows her numbers on bed bug heaters. But I have to say that all that information really came from one of my brothers, who was actually the first in our family to decide that bed bugs, you know, you can eliminate them better and with less harm to the environment by just microwaving them. And that isn't something that people
no, I have no idea.
Know a lot about. So you're right. I do mention bed bugs and talk a lot about bees, but that research part of it as a writer is so fascinating to me. And that's actually part of how I wrote Grace too. I actually went to prepper camp in order to understand what drove her so much into this kind of fear that leads her. She wants to protect her family, but what does a prepper really want to do? And so I went to a survivalist camp for 3 days and researched her as well.
Yeah, that's that's the thing about, I'm writing all this stuff down because I keep thinking of it as we talk, but that's a whole thing now. You know, it does go to the polarization that we find ourselves in the country, but it's also something that I have friends that aren't as, you know, totally compulsively involved in this, but definitely have MREs and stacks of them saved, and maybe, you know, an M16 and stuff like that. And at first and they're nice people and they're intelligent, much like in your story. And so it's difficult for me to wrap my head around what they're doing. But then part of me, did you feel that way after the camp, that you were ambivalent?
I went to the camp with a question, but I was surprised by what I found. I went to the camp thinking, what is that line, right, between preparedness and paranoia? Like, where do you step over that line from what could really happen? You know, having MREs in your house, those sound like friends, Sam, that you might want to keep. Like, they'll be prepared for the apocalypse. They've probably got water stocked, but prepping is pretty mainstream now, considering that we're in a pandemic. And many of the fears about climate change and natural disaster have come true. Many of our threats to the electric grid we're watching. And so many of the ways that preppers, I think, used to be kind of extremists are actually pretty mainstream since the pandemic. So I went to prepper camp thinking, yes, these are going to be extremists, maybe conspiracy theorists. And I was shocked to find survivalists. We spent time learning about beekeeping. We walked the forest and learned what we could eat. And I learned about solar energy. Many of the preppers actually stem from a deep distrust in government. And so they want to be able to take care of themselves. They want to be able to take care of their families. So I was surprised. I was expecting it to be more fringe than it actually was. I thought it would be more of a gun show, and it was sort of a hippie camp.
Yeah.
Grace would fit in really well there. The Fellers would not seem extremists there.
Well, that's interesting too, because without spoiling anything, although in some of the reviews they say it, and so actually I think you might say it in that little prelude you do, but I won't. But so Grace is like adamant about all this stuff and spends a good deal of her life working on this. Mm-hmm. And her family kind of goes along with it. They don't stop her from doing it. They don't argue. Well, maybe one daughter does a little bit. But, and then the other side of the coin, that's the mom of the four sisters, and the father is Robbie. Mm-hmm. And they both have unusual lifestyles that the sisters have to just cope with and come to understand. The interesting thing about it was, it reminds me of a couple I knew. Before his death, Robbie seemed like kind of a pain in the ass, you know? And he didn't seem that nice or nurturing to the kids. But then after his death, he becomes not a saint, but he becomes a much better person. Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
I think that's realistic. I mean, I really wanted to write about sudden grief and the impact of sudden grief, because I think it's different. But grief is also complicated, right? Because we are taught not to say bad things about someone who has passed away, right? We sort of revere them. And I think that much of what happens in the novel is a space for reflection on what that relationship looked like, but also a lot of growth from it. I think each of the 5 women really grow from not having a patriarch in the family. And so I think that was, for me, that was an interesting thing to explore. How does this grief affect each of the women? How do they think about their father now? And how does the family reorganize itself? And that's complicated with Robbie, because he's not a cooperative character. You know, he's very much a dominating character. And so when that power struggle, right, when that there's a vacuum of power, I would argue. But it also, I think, has to do a great deal with their political divide too. I mean, I think this is sort of a perfect read for our politically divided country in this moment. Robbie represents one very conservative way of thinking. Grace is aligned with that, but each of the daughters are coming into their own. They're very much coming of age in a time that they see these extremes in our politics, and they're trying to decide for themselves what their own value systems are. I would like to think that stories like this can help us sort of heal, that if you're not going to experience a rural prepper community in middle America, you could at least have some exposure to it, right? Like you can traffic in it for a while. You can meet people that are not maybe like you, or maybe not like your neighbors. I'm hoping that's what stories can do.
Yeah, I just read an article about children of QAnon parents are in a big dilemma now, because they're trying to say to their parents, no, not that you're insane, but this is, no, you can't think this way. And it's very difficult for them because they're fighting a losing battle. These mm-hmm. people are standing their ground.
I know a lot of people in Missouri, teenagers who are getting the vaccine, even though their parents have forbidden them to, but they're becoming adults and they believe the science, and therefore they have their own autonomy. I mean, I think as a parent, that's what you want. You raise them this way to make their own decisions. And then guess what? Sometimes they disagree with you.
Even this week when these doctors coming out saying that the vaccine makes you magnetic. And it's just, anyway. Okay, switch. One of the pivotal scene for me in the book, and the way you framed it was really cool. The way Maggie's getting the award, mm-hmm. and it seems like Robbie just doesn't want her to have the credit. He wants to somehow intervene and kind of show that it was his work when he had nothing to do with it. And then when he goes to the stage and kind of tries to weasel his way in, when he clutches his heart as if he has so much love he has so much love for children, it actually meant something else. That was like a real pivot.
I am glad you enjoyed that. There were several scenes that kind of broke my heart to write, right? And I think as a writer, that's a good thing. But I want to approach each of these characters with empathy. And I have to be able to imagine that love from Robbie's point of view. He doesn't get a lot of space on the page, right? This is not a story that's his. I never wrote his point of view. I did have to figure out each of those scenes because we have 5 point of views, but who was going to tell that story? Who had the most amount of access actually to the entire scene, and who did it impact the most? So oftentimes I rewrote some of those scenes, especially the Chamber of Commerce scene. I rewrote it from several point of views, trying to figure out which character was whose story was it and who was going to tell it to us. I think Robbie is proud of Maggie. I mean, at his core, he's absolutely proud of her. He just can't imagine not being the center of it. I think that's what his struggle is as the patriarch. He is simultaneously, and we can feel complicated things, right? We can feel both. He can both be proud of her and really struggling with why he would not be receiving all the credit for the Fehler family's success. And in many ways, he is responsible, right? He raised his daughters in the business. And I think in family businesses in particular, we inherit skills, right? We inherit wealth sometimes. We inherit just knowing how to run a business, and having that acumen is something that I think we take for granted when you grow up around it. Like, I mean, just things that I learned when I was growing up, like answering customer service phone calls.
Exactly.
You know, you just grow up in a business and you learn how to be successful if you're going to survive. And those are really skills to be passed on to a new generation.
It's like when you see a movie where they have a board and one of the members of the board is a woman and they ask her to go get a cup of coffee.
Yeah. That is, unfortunately, I think it is changing in some family business structures, but it's not changing fast enough for me, I have to say.
I don't blame you. I like the little characters you do, like the new receptionist.
Oh,
you know, yeah, because that's kind of like, it's not that it's anti-feminist, but you know, she's like really hot,
right?
Everyone's looking at her and all that, and
you see that struggle, right? Change doesn't happen quickly, and Maggie is in a very different place. At first, I think Maggie wrestles with that type of, I mean, I wouldn't even call Maggie a feminist. That's a really problematic phrase in the culture that I'm from. Not in the culture I live in Washington, D.C., but I think that's part of what I can do is kind of traffic class in that way and traffic identities in that way. But those minor characters really can reveal a great amount about the majority characters. It's not all women are this way or all men are this way. It's people are on their own path, I hope, in the novel.
And like 2 others, well, one, Val, because at first, the first page of Val, I thought, oh, you know, I don't like her. She's just going to be a mean bitch. And she turns out to be kind of the opposite, and then becomes an important part of their lives toward the end. But the other one that's not even on the page, except for like maybe doing this, is Lila. Mm-hmm. Am I pronouncing it right? Is it Lila?
I think it is. It's like I'm in charge of writing this stuff. Lila, I guess, or Layla, but I think, and part of this is regional also. In Missouri, we would have said Lila.
She's there. Mm-hmm. She's there for Kate, but there's kind of a longing, I think, in the reader for there to be a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And I think it's good that you kind of held it back.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's because it's from Kate's point of view. And so as the author, I know everything that's going to happen, but as the narrator and both Kate's point of view, we only get to know what Kate knows, which is, I think, part of what makes shifting point of views interesting, because different characters know different things. And the only person that really knows everything is the reader who's in on it. But Kate herself is coming of age and trying to struggle with her own identity. And is she attracted to her friend, which is a surprise to her, but also I think a really refreshing plot line, and really a realistic one as well. So
Yeah.
we can't know because Kate doesn't know yet.
Until one of her sisters kind of says it.
Right.
Kind of mean, but
don't you? I mean, siblings kind of know more about you sometimes than you know about yourself, unfortunately.
Yeah, definitely. And then you got to decide, if you're a sibling, do I tell this or do I just keep it here? Which is sometimes a lot harder than telling it. Yeah, not to go overboard with Lyle. I just like the way on the page she kind of like just something with her hair or smiles at her. And yeah, Kate is confused by her feelings. But the good thing about it is that I always like for readers, when the book is finished, they can say to themselves, I wonder what happened with Kate and Lila. I wonder if they got together. I wonder if they really, became a couple. And don't you think that's good, that when it's over,
you still think about him?
Yeah.
I think so. I hope so. I'm still thinking about the Fellers, and I hear from a lot of readers who want to tell me what they think happened to them. And as a professor in creative writing workshop, I will often have readers say that they want to know more. And I'm always asking, like, does it serve the story? I mean, I know curiosity wise, we want to know what happens. We want to know everything. But does that actually serve the story? Just because we want to know doesn't mean we get to know.
Yeah,
so,
I think a lot of readers, they go, I hope there's a sequel, because I want to hear what happens to the business. And I want to hear, but I don't think I think the idea of wanting that doesn't mean that you're obligated or even interested in doing something like that. Although I like the idea that the reader, like this will probably be in our book club, definitely. And everyone's going to say, I wonder why didn't she, why didn't they get together? And I love when they do that. And
I do too. They have like an ownership, like they're in the story. They are invested in these characters and they want to know the outcome too. I absolutely love that. I love when readers tell me what I should have done differently or how they would have wished it was different. I had this a great deal with my first book because it has a bit of an ambivalent ending as well. A real, true, but it wasn't a perfect bow. And that sometimes frustrates readers also, even though it's a true ending. But the characters from my first novel, Flood, which is a reimagining of Tom and Huck's Friendship as Female, some of them come back in the Hive and they're minor characters. It's a different story, different part of Missouri. But in the third novel I'm working on now, I'm finding those same characters keep popping up. They have more to say, apparently, to me. And so I think that's sort of fun when you have Easter eggs in different books for the reader. And I don't know, they seem to find that satisfying too.
Yeah, people, and they love to point it out to you.
Yeah.
I think George R. R. Martin in Game of Thrones, he has this guy in Sweden, like the guy in Sweden knows more about his books than J.R.R. Martin does. So he'll call him up and he'll go, what color shirt was he wearing? And he always knows the answer, because like you were saying, I don't know, Layla,
Right. Like, am I in charge of this? But it is true. Sometimes readers get very, very invested. And sometimes I learn things from readers that I didn't even know I did. That to me is really fascinating. In my first novel, I wrote about the Mississippi River running backwards in 1812 because of the New Madrid fault line. And my main character runs away from Hannibal, where I was actually raised. She goes to Florida. She's in Jacksonville. And a reader pointed out to me that with my metaphor of running backwards, right? That Jacksonville, the St. Johns River, actually runs, it runs backwards as well. And I didn't intend to write that. I must have known that somewhere in my mind. My dad fishes on the St. Johns River a lot. So maybe I was familiar with it, but sometimes those subconscious ways that your imagination works are pretty fascinating too.
Yeah, I lived in Gainesville for 30 years. So
you know it well.
Yeah. Yeah. I know but it surprised me just as it did you, because it didn't make any sense.
Right. Right. You're supposed to always move forward, but sometimes you have to go backward. Right. And there's this recalibration that I think is really rich for books.
So Hannibal, that reminds me, the other thread that we should follow is, because Robbie inherently doesn't trust the concept that women can succeed in running a business. He leaves in his will the business to this cousin who I thought was going to be, like tying the girls to a railroad track, like in one of those movies. But in fact, he's not a bad guy at all.
No, he turns out to be, pretty cooperative. And Brian is interesting because he he doesn't want to come in and dominate and take over. He wants to benefit from the hive. He just wants to be a part of it. And so his way of operating within it with the sisters, I think, is more authentic. He wants to be a part of it, but he also recognizes that he doesn't come in with a great amount of skill. He doesn't know how to run a business. He doesn't know anything about the pest control industry. He's a Mark Twain scholar, and not even a Mark Twain scholar. He's Mark Twain's mother. He's a Jane Clemens scholar. And so he really has taken his own path. And so in many ways, he can't really fit in. He's a first-gen college student like Jules. I'm a first-gen college student. And there's this line I think you cross over where you've lived in sort of a foreign land, and it's hard to go back because you don't see things the same way anymore. And I don't know, I think that's really rich territory for novels as well. And I think that's part of what makes Brian more curious, right? But you're right, Robbie imagines that they will need Brian in the business to succeed. Turns out they don't.
Even though he has no real interest or expertise.
He has none.
Funny, you have another minor character there is the semi-sycophantic admirer of the cousin and his knowledge of Mark Twain's mom. And then he becomes perhaps another thing the reader can think of.
So Bobby is actually a character from my first novel. And he's a pretty major character in my first novel. And so it was delightful to realize that the time period that I was working with worked perfectly well for him to go to college. And it would make sense that he had, in my first novel, he's in the Tom and Becky contest. And so he also wants to be a Tom Sawyer, and he has studied all of Mark Twain's literature. And so it felt very perfect to put him in there, actually. And he's a character I wanted to write more. He's a character that I found fascinating because he has been raised by women who don't behave conventionally, but he's okay, right? He's really found his own path. He's loved. And that's kind of the secret.
It's funny, in that Politics and Prose one, you were talking about Hannibal. And then I was thinking, okay, Mark Twain's in both of these books. Are you as fascinated by him as your characters?
When you grow up in Hannibal, this mythology of Mark Twain is all around you. Every corner has a statue. Every dinette is named after it. But it's his boyhood home. So I'm fascinated by Sam Clemens, Mark Twain is, of course, his pen name. I'm fascinated by his actual story, but also by the person, the humanitarian that he was, and how he changed so much. The boy that grew up on the streets of Hannibal is very, very different than the man who married into an abolitionist family in Elmira. They summered in Elmira. His house was actually in Hartford. The way that he changed throughout his life, to me, is something that's really fascinating. So I am fascinated with his life and with the scholarship, but when you grow up with Tom and Huck all around you, I was looking, and I'm not a Becky Thatcher. Those characters just didn't, I couldn't relate at all with those characters. And so I very much was looking for, a female version of that.
That's interesting because, every year we have a banned books week, and I take all the books out of the front window and just put the banned books in.
Yes, put mine in there. Put mine up there. You can only hope.
I think you can do better. Yeah, you do better if you I don't care what they say about me as long as they say something.
Right. Mark Twain was pretty good at that. His autobiography. Yeah, his autobiography was just released. He made sure it couldn't be released until 100 years, after his death. That's someone who wants you to keep talking about him.
Yeah, and also my favorite thing is that he was born with Halley's Comet and died with Halley's Comet. He came in and out as it went by. But the other thing is that, so what do you think about that? The fact that, how do you feel about culturally eliminating things by banning that book as part of the canon of curriculum in schools?
I'm not sure how it serves us. I think it's important to contextualize it. And I think it's also okay to say a story is or is not relevant anymore. I think it's okay, but I mean, as an educator, I would not be a fan of banning any books at all. And in fact, in my experience, when you ban them or tell students not to read them, that's the quickest way to get them to read them. So perhaps it's nicely motivating, but in the wrong ways. I can't see how it benefits us a great deal to ban books.
Well, if we go back to, how, that saying about all families are dysfunctional, they're just dysfunctional in different ways. How do you think that, I mean, they are so for different sisters.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think it is that, just as in a real hive, brings them together? I don't think it's the death of their father, but you may think it is.
I think when you grow up in a family like this, in many ways, and I do think it can, you can view the Fehler family as dysfunctional. I think that's fair. There are ways in which it doesn't seem to function. But I think there is sort of a bonding in that only you are the people who know what it's like to live in that family, right? And when families go through trauma, I think they either bond stronger or everyone leaves, right? They all separate. So I think there's also a thing to sisterhood. And that was something I really wanted to explore in the Hive, is how do sisters support each other, even when they disagree? Is that disagreement so very threatening, or is that disagreement something that we can make space for? Because I'm much more interested in difference than I am in likeness, even in my own conversations, in my own friend group. I'm much more interested because it doesn't shake my foundation to hear about or to read about or listen to someone I disagree with, right? In many ways, it might make the foundation of the Fehler family even stronger to be exposed. So I think Robbie's death propels the narrative, and in many ways it makes space in the family for the sisters to go on their own journeys. But I agree with you. I'm not sure that's not the only piece to it.
No, actually, from the very first chapter, because there Robbie's not involved. It's just the four of them, and then later on when they do like sisters or something like that, like a superpower almost, because they are. The whole is more than the parts.
Absolutely, right. And that first opening scene is exactly 1 year. It's the four sisters on the dock, and then the story follows 12 months of a calendar year in the Catholic Church. So there's also all the holy holidays that are observed. And so it had to, for me, I really wanted it to be a full year of dealing with that sudden grief, and enough room to see how the family would change. But it was also really important to me to set the story during the recession. That was a time period that I just always knew I was going to write about.
Yeah, I didn't realize. You think of all the stuff you've stuffed in there.
Mm-hmm.
Like the religions, the preppers, the politics.
We've got a lot of characters over a year, and I think it's authentic that they would have experienced this many things over a year. But the recession in particular, 2008 in Middle America, and that really growing fear and resentment, and what I experienced a great deal then was a lot of just blaming Obama for everything. It seemed to me to really set the foundation for the election 8 years later, and meant much of the radicalism that we see today. And I think that Robbie, he's a problematic member of that Hive, and he longs for a past, to me, that's just not true. That's not there. He's wrestling for power, and it's, I think, a fruitless struggle, but it's hard for him to change. And then when a character exits the novel, exits the narrative, they don't get to, right? They're just preserved in exactly the place that they were before their death.
There were two things that kind of like, well, one of the reviews says that Grace is kind of like guilt-ridden over what she's doing. Mm-hmm. I didn't think she sounded guilt-ridden at all. She seemed, at the very beginning, it just seemed like kind of nonchalant. Just he comes over, and I didn't think she felt that guilty about it.
I don't think she did while Robbie was alive. I think that the guilt happens later, and you're absolutely right, Sam. There's on the blurb for the book, it tells you that the patriarch will die. We're not giving any spoilers, but I think Grace has convinced herself that part of how she can actually protect the Hive is through having this relationship, because she believes that, and this is true when I went to prepper camp, that you want to form a community that will support you in the apocalypse. And so she believes that this extramarital affair is actually going to make her odds of saving the family stronger. I mean, we can convince ourselves of quite a few things, I have found, but she's in a pretty unhappy marriage too. And so her own desires, to me, are fascinating and interesting. And I didn't want to make that middle-aged desires problematic. I wanted to make it only challenging for how she justifies it and talks about it, not that she doesn't feel it. And I think that was, for me, one of the challenges of writing it is you have 5 women who are going through different stages of development in their own desire at the same time, in the same house. And I wanted to write each of them as true as I could.
It's interesting in that scene where you fairly accurately describe Grace's body compared to her lovers. And then, but it also reminds me that she picked the wrong guy, which also reminds me of my anti-chauvinist stance that most guys are just assholes.
It sounds like you need to write a book. Many.
Yeah.
You think Robbie was the wrong guy, or you think her affair was the wrong guy?
Her affair was the wrong guy. I mean,
I don't think any of the choices Grace necessarily makes are the right ones when it comes to love. I think she's still trying to figure that out. And Robbie and Grace are young love, right? And so many ways they've kind of grown up together. They were 18 years old. I don't know about you, but I didn't know a ton about myself when I was 18 years old.
Well, you have a 16-year-old here.
True. And that also is an error. And the question is, what do you do when you make a big mistake, right? And Tammy, and very, very much, she steals the show. And I have a character in my first novel that does that too, and really frustrates readers. But I wanted to write teen pregnancy in a fresh way. I really wanted to talk about that trajectory and the way we sort of usually portray it, especially in Hollywood, as one thing. And what it really means, and how it really shifts an entire family. So Tammy was a challenge too, but I do love a good pageant. If you want everybody together in your scene, a good funeral, a good pageant, have a wedding, it's just how you get all your characters together for all the mayhem.
Isn't it funny how families, as they kind of drift apart during 20 or 30 or 40 years, then they always get together during the funerals?
Yeah. And the same stuff happens. You just step right into your exact same pattern. When we go back home, my children are sort of aghast at the person I am there versus the mother that they know. But you get right back in the exact same rhythms. You say the same things. My accent gets very strong as soon as I fly into St. Louis. My accent gets thicker as I drive north.
That's funny. The other thing that was surprising to me was, at first I thought, okay, their financial situation is kind of bad. Then I thought, wow, it's really bad. And then I thought, holy mackerel, this is like the worst financial situation I've ever seen anybody in my life. And yet, I don't know. I mean, it's like, could I overcome that? I don't think so. It's just like superhuman. And Maggie, you know how you said Tammy steals the show. Maggie's just like the bedrock of the thing.
And that financial struggle, to me, growing up in middle America,
it's not that unusual.
No, it's not that unusual. I mean, I think all of us are one step from medical bankruptcy when you really think about what it means to have chronic illness. That, to me, is not unfamiliar. It seems a shock to this family, right? And then, you know, you mentioned chauvinism. It doesn't surprise me that Robbie has been hiding his own failures and really his own struggles, just trying to keep the family afloat and to give truly with good intentions to provide for his wife, to provide for his daughters. And he doesn't think it is his role to share that burden, right? He very much has a pride in it, that he won't tell the rest of the family how much they are struggling financially because he wants to seem as if he's got it all together. He wants to appear as a successful businessman, even though he's not. And I think there's real shame in that being revealed after his death. It makes me very sad for his character, and also, you know, that his death caused additional financial hardship. It is pretty heartbreaking too, but it does seem realistic to me. I know I grew up in a part of the country and know families and that struggle a great deal. And it's a different mindset.
Yeah, I know. You know, I practiced law I'm still practicing kind of. I practiced law for some 30 years, and it's amazing how many families the patriarch does not prepare for what's going to happen after either he doesn't get around to it or he doesn't want to do it, and then he dies, and then in this case, kind of like the reading of the will, and they're just shocked.
Mm-hmm. We lack imagination, and we do not want to talk about death, right? Which is why I think sudden grief is so fascinating, because you're right, no one has prepared for it. Although Robbie has prepared a bit for it.
Yeah, apparently.
And I don't want to, yeah, I don't want to give too much away, but he has definitely considered, secession. He just only considers it from his point of view. He doesn't include the rest of the family in those plans.
Yeah. And as you said earlier, it's not something you can really just say you blame him or that he's a bad person. It's just something that's inculcated in him, as it appears to be in a lot of the people that you grew up with.
It's complicated. I mean, I really do believe that Robbie had good intentions, but we all have pretty large blind spots, right? About how we perceive the world versus perhaps the way that our families, the way that the people who love us do. And I think that's certainly true with the Fehler family.
Well, as I said before we started, since I have an independent bookstore, covers made a big deal with regard to my clientele. So in order to actually sell your book, why don't you show us the cover of it? Because it's a great cover.
It's such a fantastic cover. I am so in love with the cover. It even has this like glowing, it's a honeycomb print, but it glows, doesn't it? It's bringing you in.
Yeah, it's like, you can't not pick the book up when you come into the store.
I hope so. I love that. It's a beautiful cover. And my editor at Turner hired an artist out of West Virginia, Andrea Akers, to actually sketch each of these. And each of the insects actually has its own story based on where it was found by Robbie and Grace on their honeymoon. And so she sketched each of these insects, and then Lauren Peters Collier actually did the book design for it. And so the amount of care that went into it really touched me. It was really important to me that it represented. And I think they made a beautiful cover. And I'm super happy if readers immediately think, wow, that's just a book I need to pick up and hold. And it even is textured. I love when they do that with book covers too.
I know.
You probably have an ARC. You may not have the textures on it yet.
No, I know that publishers like authors a lot when they give them texture or deckled edges.
It's true. It's absolutely true. And that the insects even, fly around on the back cover too. They took great care with this. They've been very good to me. They believe in the book.
I think if you had hissing cockroaches and palmetto bugs on the cover, I don't think
nobody wants. No, in fact, my agent tells me to stop talking about bed bugs. She really is worried that that's going to make people not want to read the story, but I don't think so. I think it's the right story for a politically divided moment in our country. It just happens to have a beautiful cover.
Well, I was kind of pissed off at you because I was reading it in bed and I started getting itchy. You can't help it, right?
I'm sure that's my fault.
Yes, it is. I don't have bed bugs. Well, I mean,
I can tell from here, as an expert, I can tell from here you are safe and free from bed bugs.
That's pretty good if you can look at somebody.
Yeah, I can do that. I identified a tick over the weekend. I'm really impressed our dinner guests. It's a party trick you want to have.
Oh, that was the other thing. So when people picked up the book, the first thing they do is they go inside and a lot of them and look at the epigraph. And so, read the epigraph. Just read the epigraph then.
I'll try and be what he loves to call me, a little woman, and not be rough and wild, but do my duty here instead of wanting to be somewhere else. And that's, of course, from Little Women, Louisa May Alcott.
So at first, if you read the epigraph, you might think, okay, Maggie is going to be subservient. She's just going to fall into the pattern that's designed for her by the patriarchy. But that's not what happens.
No, it is not. But I would argue that the Little Women are also, in a different time period, feminists in their own right. I mean, they are strong women who are self-sufficient, who take care of themselves. The patriarch is also gone, right? He's at the Civil War. And so I was playing with it. I don't think the characters line up perfectly, but in having some characters that are more progressive and some characters that are more conservative and bringing that tension into the family, I think it was ripe for a retelling. So you're right, though. If Little Women is about women trying to control themselves, and I don't think it actually is, then it does lead you to believe the story might be one way. But the rest of the quotes are from Mark Twain, of course, and also from Joan Didion about grief,
Right.
and what grief actually does as a reorganization of your person.
Yeah, that was a great book, Joan Didion's.
It's just one of my absolute favorites. It was stunning that she could write that when she did. She's just mad talented. She's amazing.
I know. It's like, how could you have a year like that and then be able to express, I don't know.
And give it to the rest of us as a gift and a guide for living. It's pretty astounding.
There's a book by C.S. Lewis called A Grief Observed, which is very similar to that. And when someone, that's the other thing. When someone dies, I hate it when people come up to them and go, if there's anything I can do. But, there is one thing you could do. You could bring the person back to life. But other than that, a casserole, well, there's casseroles in the book.
Lots of casseroles.
Yeah, why casseroles? And Jello. Well, in Missouri, I guess Jello.
There's always Jello at family reunions. There's always casseroles. Casseroles are a lot because they're pantry items. And so if you don't have, we grew all of our own vegetables out in the country, but you don't always have access to fresh fruits and vegetables in a lot of, food deserts. And so casseroles are pantry items. And when you need one, right, you have all the ingredients and you just never know. You're always making casseroles in the Midwest.
My favorite is the tuna noodle casserole.
You like that one the most?
Yeah, I would say that's mine. What's your favorite?
I really like making a mac and cheese with jalapenos.
Ooh.
It's really good. Nice crusty panko top, good Parmesan.
The panko makes a big difference. But though on the tuna noodle casserole, you can use those Durkee's onion rings, which I like those too.
Those go on the green bean casserole.
That's what I meant. Yeah, yes.
Yeah, with the cream of mushroom soup on your Thanksgiving table.
Yeah.
I don't actually serve those. I just serve fresh green beans with some orange zest.
Well, after my divorce, one of my many, I can't remember the number of my divorces, but after one. Oh, well, I shouldn't say this, but that's the story of my life. But for the first time after this month, it'll be the first time in 34 years that I'm not paying either alimony or child support.
There's a freedom to that.
Not that there's any reason.
Except you need it. No, what you're saying is you need a casserole to celebrate. It would be appropriate at this point for me to show up for a casserole, and so you can celebrate.
Well, the key is I need to make it myself because
yes,
I need to prove that I can make the casserole.
It sounds like I know what you're having for dinner.
Yeah, next month. The other thing that reminded me of something about the epigraph was that, and I wasn't sure I understood this, but I think the Politics and Prose one, I can't remember, you said that feminism rises from rural roots. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't know what that means.
Where I'm from, that word is problematic, right? It sounds like a word that means something to women who live in cities, who are on the East or the West Coast, and it comes with a certain amount of baggage and labels that a lot of women I know would not embrace. But everything it stands for is something the women I know would embrace. So independence, right? Being financially independent, having a say. And I do think this is a class difference. When I didn't know women who didn't work. Like, it wasn't until I moved to the suburbs of DC that I found out there were these things, that women stayed home with families as a choice. Where I'm from, everybody works because you can't afford not to. And so when the women work on the farms beside the men, there is an equality to that. And when everybody works on the factory line because you're just trying to make ends meet, and then one woman in our neighborhood would raise the kids, right? I had 27 first cousins. I grew up at everybody else's house because everybody's trying to make it. Everybody's trying to make ends meet. And so that type of, what we call feminism, right? What in my circles, my university circles in particular, think of as feminism. The values are similar, but where they actually come from, I think makes a huge difference. And so there's a lot of feminism to me in those rural roots. And in the characters, the second generation of the characters in the Fehler family are, I think, awakening to that. That's what I mean by rising from those roots.
Do you ever, since you have 21 first cousins, do you ever have like gigantic family reunions like you always see in the South?
Yes, we do. We have one every August.
You wear the same t-shirts?
I have never seen t-shirts. Why don't we have t-shirts? Maybe we need t-shirts. I will get on that. There's a lot of us. I mean, there's more than 100 of us if you get us all together, because yeah, we have a lot of family in the Midwest. But we don't have t-shirts, and I'm not sure why, but there are a lot of casseroles. There's a lot of casseroles. There's a lot of quilt making. Everyone, you know, my grandfather made his own furniture. There's a lot of skill within the family too. Things I just grew up thinking that was normal. You know, we all grow up thinking our families are normal.
So you have like these long tables with red and white gingham tablecloths, and
we do have long tables. Sometimes our family is so big. There's one aunt that still has a house big enough to hold us, or we rent out the there's a nutrition center in my town that an aunt of mine used to run, and now my cousins do. And so we'll rent out that space so that we all have a space together as well. We're big. We're very big.
I think it's weird that I don't talk about the book.
I think you are. You're talking about family, and you're talking about the characters. My favorite type of interview like this is when you understand and know the characters, right? Like we're talking about them as if they are real people.
Yeah, it's a two-way street. I mean, I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't like the book, and I wouldn't be doing this. Well, I know I'm going to remember. I think I'll remember these names. Mm-hmm. You know, I think I'll remember the names, and I always think that's another sign of a good book. You know, we're talking about leaving the reader to imagine the rest of the lives, because that has nothing to do with the book. It's in the reader's head. Mm-hmm. And then the idea of remembering the characters as if you, like Val, for example, for some reason, she just sticks there because I can kind of, and then also, this is probably, since Netflix, this is a perfect option.
Sony has bought the rights to it. They have optioned it. It hasn't moved into production yet, but I think it's pretty close. But I don't read. It surprises readers that as the author, I know very little about I mean, I understand the process, but once you option it, it's really in the producer's hands to tell the story. I have been able to sit in on pitch sessions, and it's fantastic. They really understand the book, and that means a lot to me. There's a lot of, I think, Hollywood movies that are about poverty and about rural culture that have a lot of stereotypes in them that make me uncomfortable. And so to have producers that understand my vision, I'm delighted and hopeful.
Yeah, until I asked the question, I never thought about the book actually being cinematic, and it is. Mm-hmm. Plus, you can expand it because you can have these guys go out on their routes in their trucks, to the houses, and you can have the bugs.
I mean, I guess that sounds interesting. For me, that was just, what my uncle did and what my brothers did. And that seemed very normal to me.
Did you ever go along with them?
Of course I did. If you want to ride home from anywhere, you have to get in a technician's truck and carpool. That's carpool. Yeah, I grew up with it. I grew up counting glue boards and cleaning the garage and cleaning trucks and answering phones. When you're in a family business, every single person in the family works. In my experience.
Mice on glue boards is something that's really disgusted me all my life.
Well, luckily my job was to count the glue boards in the what we call the chemical room, and then load the trucks for the technicians. I can't say that I have a lot of experience with what happens afterwards.
Yeah.
But we do a lot of my dad would do on the weekends, a lot of live trapping, which is where he goes out and he live traps it and then he takes it and relocate. We called it the witness relocation program. They're somewhere else as far as the owner knows. And so there's some humanity in that. But my dad felt strongly about bees also, that if you relocated the hive, there was no reason to kill them, right? They were useful. And,
Yeah.
and when you live in the country, something that's useful gets to stay.
And when I was researching the book, as I was reading it and going down the YouTube rabbit hole, it was interesting watching this one woman, especially relocating hives and having a queen in a box, and then the bees just kind of left the place.
Follow.
Yeah, and it was just really cool. I had never seen that before.
Bees are absolutely fascinating. I cannot watch enough bee documentaries or learn enough about how they operate and how they take care of each other, and that everybody has a role. I find them absolutely fascinating, what they can survive. Talk about true survivors.
And their communication. Like, we have no comprehension. People can say they understand it, but we don't really understand it.
No, I think bees have a lot to teach us.
Yep, I agree. As long as they stay around, geez, just scary.
And that's part of why I wanted, and Grace's evolution and thought process about her own gardening, her own plantings, I think changes a great deal through the book too, because she feeds her family that way. And so thinking about how to preserve the ecosystem around her, and Val as well. I mean, Val's a character who understands that it's better to live with than to just destroy. And really we need them, right?
Speaking of animals and insects, okay, we'll conclude because let's talk about we'll conclude with Nacho because I forgot about him, but he's everywhere.
Right. I when you grow up in the country, dogs are everywhere. I never knew that dogs were on leashes, and I never understood until I moved to the city that dogs were pets in a different way. And so for me, dogs are in all of my novels, all of my stories, and the bond with a dog. That's very strong in Kate, in each member. And so Nacho, I think Nacho kind of steals the show, as most dogs do.
Yeah, I know. It's funny. We have these New Yorker cartoon cards at the bookstore, and I realized that the only ones that are funny are the ones that have dogs in them. And I go back there and laugh out loud, and the customers have. I do it every day. So they shouldn't be funny anymore, but they are.
They're funny every time.
I just send you one. And then another dog comes in. Would you bring cheese in there? Well, I mean, how did he come in, and why? I mean, what are you thinking?
It's you can't have enough. You just need more. Everybody needs a companion. And that was a surprise too. There are these really delicious moments as a writer, just in the first draft, where you're writing and things are going one way, and then you get a surprise too, right? And then it's your job to figure out if that plot point stays and how, then you're in charge of it, right? But there are moments when you're drafting. I didn't know there was going to be multiple dogs, but it was a delight. And that conversation actually is a conversation my kids have had about naming dogs. I mean, dogs are fun to name. My dog is named Huckleberry Finn Nacho Scholes Young.
Well, we should spend another time just talking about Twain, because I love talking about him too. But it's interesting how he enters both of these books, and how you have this, like you said, not Easter eggs, but you could have you can have your own cinematic universe like Marvel.
It's true. I have a lot more story ideas too.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's great. Let's end it on that note.
Okay.
And I look forward to your next one, because it sounds like you're in the middle of it.
I'm in the middle of the third novel, and I'm just finished the next book, which is actually nonfiction.
Maybe it'll all become Faulkner-esque. But I can't. No, it's too inaccessible for me. I'm not smart enough. Okay. Well, thanks so much, Melissa. It was a pleasure talking to you.
You as well. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. See you soon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.